Lesson 4 describes the release and deployment management process, and it has 4 main objectives. First, we'll understand the main objectives and key terms of this process. Next, we'll learn more about the definitive media library and where it fits in with the configuration management system and the configuration management database. We'll also learn about how change management, release and deployment management, and service asset and configuration management work together. And we'll finish up with a brief discussion on the roles of this process. Release and deployment management's job is to build, test, and deliver the capability to provide the services we specified way back there in service design, and that will also accomplish what the stakeholders were hoping it would. Up until this point, we've been strategizing in service strategy and designing in service design and preparing for this moment. But release and deployment management builds, tests, and then installs the services so the business can finally use them. This is our moment of truth. The main objectives of release and deployment management are to create a release policy which governs how we develop and maintain comprehensive release and deployment plans. Another objective is to make sure that all the components of our release can actually do what the business is requiring it to do. But before we install anything, though, the folks who are doing this process are responsible for creating all support documentation and doing all training. And that's end-user training as well as IT staff training, as in, how do we support this going forward? The service desk should also get some training, as well as some troubleshooting information and documentation for their knowledge base. The change manager should not authorize changes until this training and documentation work has been done. It's best to check with the service desk to make sure that they're ready for this release to go live. As we've said before, the release and deployment management process is the process responsible for physically getting the hands dirty and installing and executing these changes. When we're installing these changes, it's important to make sure that the changes don't negatively impact the current services in production. This last bullet sounds a little strange, but it's true. Release and deployment's objective is to ensure the customer satisfaction with all of the service transition practices and outputs. So not just release and deployment managements, but for the practices and outputs of the entire service transition lifecycle phase. If you think about it, it kind of makes sense, since release and deployment management is the biggest customer-facing process of service transition. Customers never really interface with service asset and configuration management, and they'll only deal with change management if they're the ones who requested a change. But release and deployment management is the service transition process that affects the end users the most. And this one is also in italics, so keep an eye out for this tricky bullet. Let's take a look at some release and deployment management related vocabulary. The first term we have is release. Release is both a noun and a verb. When we release something, it means that we install it into the production environment. As a noun, a release is a collection of authorized changes and must be accompanied by an RFC which effectively defines it. So think of a release as a change that's being put into production. The next term we have is a release unit, which is a portion of a service or of the IT infrastructure that's normally released in one shot. If I were to receive a new laptop, we could call it a release unit, because it's a combination of CIs that make sense together. My laptop consists of the hardware itself, plus the operating system, plus Office 2007, plus a copy of the manual. If you handed me one of these things without the others, I couldn't use it. A copy of Office 2007 with no PC doesn't really do me any good. But the 4 things bundled together and introduced to the production environment, meaning placed on my desk, at the same time is useful. Next, we have a release package, which is one or more release units that are bundled together. This is easiest to think of in terms of software. Instead of distributing 12 patches across a network one at a time, we can bundle these and release them together as a package. The last term we have is release policy. And a release policy is a document written by your release and deployment manager. And it's a document where we can find things like a name and numbering convention for our releases, information on where to store our releases, also a statement on how often we'll release certain things. We know that on Tuesdays, Windows Update pings the Microsoft mothership to see if there are any patches in queue. Some companies let Windows Update do its thing automatically, and other companies want to test the Microsoft patches first and then release them manually. Your company's feelings on this topic need to be specified in your release policy. These terms may show up on an exam, so if you need clarification on these terms, you can refer to the book that came with this DVD. Back in the Service Asset and Configuration Management process, we talked about the DML, which is the Definitive Media Library. The DML is a single logical repository that stores authorized versions of electronic media CIs. Things like authorized software, regardless of whether it was bought off the shelf or built in-house, licenses and activation keys, master copies of important documentation, like your policies, processes, procedures, and plans, like your availability plan, capacity plan, and IT service continuity plan. Like we said earlier, the DML doesn't have to be one physical location. You could store official documents on SharePoint, shrink-wrapped software in a closet, and your proprietary software on a network share. As long as there's no duplication, you're fine. Please note that we do not store backups or backup copies of anything in the DML. It's also important to remind you that Service Asset and Configuration Management owns and manages the Definitive Media Library, but Release and Deployment Management uses it the most day to day. If we need to update the DML with a new version of a piece of software, then that is going to go through change management. If the Definitive Media Library stores definitive versions of your electronic media, then hardware is stored in a closet labeled Definitive Spares. Now, this isn't your hardware graveyard where you store half-broken components and random cables. This is where production-ready spare parts or entire spare systems are sitting, ready to be deployed if necessary. Some companies like to keep a lot of stuff in their Definitive Spares closet because they can replace broken hardware faster if they have it on hand. Other companies like to keep their Definitive Spares to a minimum because there's no guarantee that it'll be used up before it's obsolete. Just like the DML, the contents of the Definitive Spares is listed in your CMS or your CMDB. During the Service Asset and Configuration Management process, we said that all CIs, which are hardware, software, people, documentation, and the relationships between those components, are stored in the CMDB. But really, just the information about those items is stored in the CMDB. The actual items themselves are physically located elsewhere. Hardware is stored in the Definitive Spares. Electronic media CIs like software and documentation are physically stored in the DML, and people are stored in cubes. Let's apply this. If a user calls the service desk and needs Adobe Acrobat installed, the service desk will look in the CMDB to look up what version of software this person should get. The CMDB will also point the service desk person to the actual Adobe Installer.msi file location. If the service desk has permission, then the service desk can install that software for the end user. This slide shows us how the three big processes of service transition work together. I call these processes the service transition trifecta, but you can call it whatever you want. I'm going to walk you through a day in the life of a change. And this is very oversimplified, but I just want you to see how these processes work together. Frank in accounting realizes that the accounting package they're using today is going to max out soon. It can only track 1,000 cost centers, but he'll need 2,000 by next year. So he submits a request for change using a self-service tool on your company's intranet. When he hits the Submit button, the request for change gets logged in the system, and the change manager gets a notification to go look at it. The change manager sees that this looks to be a sizable change, and because of this, the change manager bounces this over to the application management function to see what they think. The application management function is one of 4 functions in ITIL, and the application management function specifically helps us decide whether we should buy or build a piece of software. The application management function confirms that they do have the time and the resources to work on this project, so they let the change manager know. A project team gets created, and the application management function, together with the accounting department, choose a piece of software that will meet their needs, and they begin building and testing their solution. This building and testing piece can take a long time. Once the solution is ready to be installed and go live, the people from the application management function and some from the accounting department get invited to the next change management meeting. They tell the change advisory board what they've done to prepare this release, how they've tested it, how they've educated the service desk about how to support it, how they've trained the end users on how to use it, how they wrote all the documentation for it, how they know that it's going to be a successful change, and what they'll do in the event that the change doesn't go successfully, etc., etc. If the CAB is convinced, the change advisory board will advise the change manager to authorize the release. The change manager authorizes it, and the application management function people, who are now wearing release and deployment hats, implement and install the change. After it goes live, the application people and the accounting folks are invited back to the next change advisory board meeting to have a post-implementation review for lessons learned and to see how everything went. The final step is for the change manager to give the configuration librarian, that's the person who keeps the CMDB up to date, a list of all the new and changed CIs so the CMDB stays current. The roles associated with release and deployment management are the release and deployment management process owner, who does the DEMI duties for this process. Next, we have the release package and build manager, who builds and tests the final release. And if you choose to, you can have a separate team for actually deploying the release. In smaller organizations, you may choose to combine these two roles. The good news is that you don't need to know these roles for the exam. More good news is that this role slide wraps up this lesson on release and deployment management. Let's move on to Lesson 5 and learn about knowledge management.